The Middle East, a region often synonymous with warfare, instability, and conflict, has been a place where turmoil seems to never cease. Since the turn of the 21st century, major wars have ravaged Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Yemen, involving countries like Iran, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey, alongside powers beyond the Middle East, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. These conflicts have claimed millions of lives, displaced millions more, and cost trillions of dollars. The region's status as the most geopolitically volatile area in the world has left many asking, why does this region suffer so much, and why will we likely continue to hear about wars and conflict here for the rest of our lives? To answer these questions, we must look at the origins of the modern Middle East. The modern borders of the region, drawn by colonial powers in the early 20th century, are key to understanding its continuous instability. The roots of the problems we see today stretch back more than 100 years, to the time before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent reshaping of the region by European powers. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire was the dominant power in the Middle East. Its reign stretched from Hungary in the north to Yemen in the south. With vast territories encompassing modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond. The empire was a complex, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, home to a rich tapestry of peoples, including Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Armenians, Jews, and many others. These diverse groups lived under Ottoman rule, often with little interference in their daily lives, as long as they paid taxes and acknowledged the Sultan's authority. Despite this relative autonomy, the Ottoman Empire was fiercely centralized. The sultans ruled with absolute power, and nationalism in any form was considered a threat to the stability of the empire. Local identities and loyalties to ethnicity or religion were suppressed in favor of loyalty to the Ottoman state. This allowed the empire to maintain a relatively unified and stable rule for centuries. Despite the vast differences among its peoples, the Ottomans built a system of governance that, for all its flaws, kept the diverse empire together. From the bustling markets of Cairo to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In fact, the Ottoman Empire controlled the major pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina, solidifying its role as a key power in the Muslim world. Yet, over time, it began to face internal decline, corruption, economic challenges, and the rise of nationalism in Europe started to take their toll. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire's power was weakening. Several revolutions and uprisings, fueled by nationalist movements, started to chip away at the empire's once unified territory. A rising sense of national identity began to emerge among the peoples of the Balkans, and, later, the Arabs, Kurds, and others began to seek independence. The empire, unable to adapt quickly enough to these new forces, began to fracture. During this period of decline, European powers, particularly Britain and France, began to eye the strategic significance of the Ottoman-held Middle East. The region's location was incredibly valuable. Sitting at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, with access to important trade routes and key resources, including oil. The most immediate concern for Britain was the access to India, its prized colony, and the security of the routes that connected it to the home islands. For Britain, the Mediterranean was a key geopolitical area, and the Ottoman control of the region represented a potential threat to British interests. The British Empire had long been interested in securing a reliable route to India, but it was the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, that truly emphasized the Middle East's importance. The Suez Canal provided the fastest sea route between Britain and India, slashing the travel time between the two regions. By controlling the Suez Canal, Britain was able to solidify its economic and military dominance in the region. However, the Ottomans controlled Egypt, which was crucial to the canal's security. In response to this, Britain moved to exert more influence over Egypt, initially gaining access to the region through a series of treaties and military interventions. By 1882, Egypt became a British protectorate, with the Suez Canal becoming effectively British-controlled. This was the beginning of Britain's expanding influence in the region. Over the next few decades, Britain and France would divide up much of the Ottoman Empire's land. This wasn't just about securing trade routes, it was about resources too. The Middle East was rich in oil, which was becoming an increasingly critical resource for the modern world, especially after the Industrial Revolution. This strategic need for oil pushed Britain and other European powers, like France, to further entrench themselves in the Middle East. In 1914, when World War I broke out, the Ottoman Empire, fearing growing British interference in its internal affairs, chose to side with Imperial Germany. However, this decision would seal the empire's fate. As the war ended, it became clear that the Ottomans had lost their once thriving empire. The British and French, both deeply involved in the war's outcome, made plans for the future of the region, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement would soon follow. In 1916, British and French diplomats Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot secretly negotiated how to divide the Ottoman lands between the two countries once the empire collapsed. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was meant to be a temporary solution, laid the groundwork for the modern borders of the Middle East. The agreement divided the region into areas of British and French control, with the British taking Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, while the French took control of Syria and Lebanon. However, the Sykes-Picot Agreement paid little attention to the region's complex, diverse makeup of peoples, cultures, religions, and languages. The lines drawn by Sykes and Picot created countries with no regard for ethnic or religious divisions. Iraq, for example, was an artificial construction made up of the provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, which were each home to different groups: Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Kurds, and others. The new Iraq, under British control, forced these diverse groups into a single state, setting the stage for future conflicts. The same was true for Syria and Lebanon, where borders were drawn without regard for the region's deeply entrenched sectarianism and ethnic diversity. The creation of these artificial borders would set in motion a century of instability in the Middle East. Britain and France had carved up the region based on imperial interests, with little thought for the consequences of these decisions on the people who lived there. The old Ottoman rule, which had been able to suppress nationalism and maintain unity through force, was gone, and the new colonial powers were more concerned with their own interests than with the welfare of the region's people. Thus, the seeds of modern conflict were planted. The Middle East's diverse populations, already living under Ottoman rule with little regard for their desires or identities, found themselves suddenly divided into nations based on arbitrary borders, setting off a century of ethnic and religious clashes that would reverberate throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. As the Ottoman Empire fell and European powers carved up its territories, the Middle East's future was forever changed. The legacies of the British and French colonial decisions, like the arbitrary drawing of borders, the lack of regard for ethnic or sectarian divisions, and the quest for control over resources would shape the region's destiny, creating the foundation for the conflicts we witness today. By the time World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire, once a mighty force, had crumbled. The defeat of the Ottomans opened the door for the Western powers, mainly Britain and France, to determine the fate of the Middle East. The region, which had been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was now at the mercy of European powers seeking to secure their own interests. In 1916, British and French diplomats, Sykes and Francois Georges-Picot, secretly negotiated a pact to divide the Ottoman Empire's lands between their respective countries. The result was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secretive, one-sided deal that would dramatically reshape the Middle East's political map. The agreement was driven more by imperial ambitions than by any consideration for the ethnic, cultural, or religious realities of the region. Instead of honoring the diverse makeup of the Ottoman territories, the Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the region into zones of British and French influence. Britain took control of Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, while France was given control over Syria and Lebanon. The agreement left Palestine under an international mandate, recognizing its significant religious and cultural value to multiple groups. However, no consideration was given to the millions of Arabs, Kurds, and other ethnicities who had lived under Ottoman rule for centuries. This division of the Middle East created a blueprint for future conflicts. In Iraq, the British combined three vastly different provinces, Baghdad and Mosul, home to distinct ethnic and religious groups. Shia Arabs in Basra, Sunni Arabs in Baghdad, Kurds in Mosul. These divisions created deep political and social fissures that would persist throughout the century. In Syria and Lebanon, the French followed a similar approach. Lebanon was designated as a Christian-majority state, but its population was diverse, with significant Sunni and Shia Muslim communities. Syria, similarly, was split into several regions, each with its own ethnic and sectarian populations. The French mandate ignored the deep-rooted rivalries and divisions that existed. And as a result, Syria would experience years of instability. The legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement is still evident today. The arbitrary borders it created, with little consideration for the indigenous populations, sowed the seeds for the numerous conflicts that would define the modern Middle East. The region's political map became a puzzle of competing ethnic, religious, and nationalist interests, with many groups feeling sidelined by the European powers that carved up their homelands. After World War I, the colonial powers of Britain and France set out to reshape the Middle East according to their interests. The Sykes-Picot Agreement may have drawn the initial lines on the map, but other developments after the war made the Middle East even more critical to global geopolitics. The region's vast untapped oil reserves would soon be discovered and would become a driving force in the economic and military strategies of the Western powers. Britain, already deeply invested in the Middle East through its control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, saw oil as a critical resource that would ensure the survival of its empire. The discovery of oil in Iran in 1908 by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later known as BP, was a game-changer. The British knew that oil would be vital for fueling the new military technology of the 20th century, from airplanes to battleships. But Iran's oil, though valuable, was still considered limited in comparison to what might lie hidden elsewhere in the region. In the wake of the war, the British and French set their sights on securing more territory in the Middle East, especially where they believed massive untapped oil reserves existed. Iraq, for example, had not yet been fully explored for oil, but British officials were convinced that the area contained vast amounts of crude. The importance of controlling the oil in the Middle East was underscored by the rise of mechanized warfare during World War I. Oil became the lifeblood of modern military power, and the British, in particular, understood that controlling the region's oil would ensure continued dominance in both Europe and Asia. While oil was a key motivating factor, the post-war negotiations also saw the rise of competing interests. The French, though primarily interested in maintaining influence over Syria and Lebanon, were also interested in the oil-rich regions of the Levant. At the same time, the United States, which had remained more removed from European colonial ambitions up until that point, had become a global economic power, and its oil companies began taking a more active role in the Middle East. By the 1920s, the United States, through its oil companies, was establishing footholds in countries like Saudi Arabia, which was rich in oil reserves. For Britain and France, the potential of oil created a need to maintain a foothold in the region, and their increasing influence would lead to further tensions with local nationalist movements and the rise of anti-colonial sentiment. The Middle East, with its immense geopolitical and economic value, was now at the center of global power struggles. As World War I came to a close and the Ottoman Empire's grip on the region loosened, Britain and France moved quickly to establish control over the lands they had carved up through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The new Middle Eastern states were designed not with the people of the region in mind, but with the strategic interests of the European powers at the forefront. The legacy of this imperial division would have profound consequences that continue to resonate throughout the region today. Iraq, which emerged from the British Mandate, was one of the most complicated creations. The British combined the Ottoman provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul into a single state, despite the fact that these regions were home to different ethnic and religious groups, each with its own interests. The Shia Arabs of Basra, the Sunni Arabs of Baghdad, and the Kurds of Mosul had long-standing differences, and their forced union into one country left deep scars. This fragmentation laid the foundation for future conflicts in Iraq, from the uprisings of the 1920s to the Iraq-Iran War in the 1980s, and even the Iraq War in 2003, Syria, the French faced a similarly complex situation. The former Ottoman provinces of Aleppo, Damascus, and Beirut, along with the diverse populations they contained, were turned into the French Mandate of Syria. This new state had a polyglot population with Sunnis, Alawites, Christians, Kurds, and Druze all living together, often with competing political ambitions. The French, who aimed to maintain their influence over the region, had to deal with frequent uprisings, and the tensions between these various groups would lead to years of conflict. Lebanon, also under French mandate, was created as a Christian majority state, despite the fact that it was home to a significant Muslim population. The French, drawing borders based on religious divisions, set up a system that favored the Christian minority, leading to a deep-seated sense of disenfranchisement among the Muslim population. The political system that emerged in Lebanon was based on sectarian quotas, with power divided between the various religious groups, but this system failed to prevent tensions and would eventually erupt into the Lebanese Civil War 1975 to 1990. The creation of these states artificially imposed by European powers with little consideration for the local populations set the stage for ongoing struggles in the region. The boundaries drawn by the French and British did not reflect the complex, multi-ethnic nature of the region. Instead, they created states that were internally fractured, with competing groups vying for control. These artificial divisions continue to fuel conflict in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond, as the region grapples with the legacies of imperialism and the quest for national identity. The continued tension between the region's diverse communities, along with the discovery of vast oil reserves, would ensure that the Middle East remained a flashpoint for global conflict well into the 20th century. The decisions made by colonial powers in the early 20th century would shape the destinies of millions of people, and the echoes of their actions can still be heard today. As the Middle East continues to struggle with the consequences of borders drawn with little regard for its people's history and aspirations. As the Middle East moved into the post-World War II era, the region found itself in a constant state of flux. The emergence of new ideologies, particularly the rise of secular Arab nationalism and Islamic movements, began to reshape the region's political landscape. Amid this shifting power structure, one event would dramatically alter the region's trajectory: the Islamic Revolution in Iran. In 1979, the long-standing monarchy of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was overthrown in a popular revolution led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the leader of the Shia clerical establishment. This revolution, which saw the establishment of the first theocratic government in the region, fundamentally shifted the balance of power. The new Iranian regime, inspired by Khomeini's brand of Shia Islam, sought to create an Islamic state that would serve as a model for the entire Muslim world. Iran's revolutionary leadership believed that the time had come for Islamic governance to replace secular regimes that were seen as corrupt and illegitimate. For many Arab states, the rise of Iran as a Shia Islamist power was deeply unsettling. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the Gulf states, which were governed by Sunni monarchies or secular regimes, feared that the Iranian Revolution could inspire similar uprisings within their own borders. These concerns came to a head when, shortly after the revolution, Iran began calling for the spread of its Islamic ideals across the region. Iran sought to export its revolution to Shia-majority areas, and the idea of a pan-Islamic uprising against secularism and monarchy was appealing to some groups in the Arab world. The Sunni monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia, were terrified by the idea of a Shia-led revolution spreading throughout the Middle East. They feared the destabilizing effects that an Iranian-led revolution could have, especially given the Shia populations in countries like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. For Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, this fear was particularly intense. As a Sunni Arab, Saddam was wary of Iran's influence over Iraq's own Shia majority and saw the Iranian Revolution as a direct challenge to his regime. This tension led to the brutal Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980. Saddam Hussein, fearing the spread of Shia revolution into Iraq, launched a preemptive strike against Iran, hoping to neutralize the revolutionary threat before it could spread. The war, which would last for 8 years, became one of the most devastating conflicts in modern history, with an estimated 1 million people killed. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, neither Iran nor Iraq emerged victorious. The war ended in 1988 in a stalemate, with both sides suffering irreparable damage. The Iran-Iraq War was a defining moment in the Middle East, and its consequences reverberated throughout the region. For Iraq, the war drained its resources, destabilized the country, and created an environment ripe for Saddam Hussein's future aggression. For Iran, the war solidified its revolutionary ideology and set the stage for future confrontations with Iraq and other Arab states. The conflict also exacerbated Sunni-Shia tensions in the region, which would continue to play a significant role in the years to come. As the 1980s came to an end, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, found itself in a precarious situation. The Iran-Iraq War had left the country economically shattered and politically isolated. Saddam Hussein's desire to reassert Iraq's dominance in the region led to a dangerous confrontation with Kuwait, a small, oil-rich nation that Saddam accused of overproducing oil and violating OPEC agreements. But Saddam's ambitions went beyond economic grievances. He believed that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq and that its wealth should be Iraq's. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, quickly overwhelming its military and occupying the country. This bold move threatened the stability of the entire Gulf region, particularly Saudi Arabia, which shared a border with Kuwait and held the world's largest oil reserves. The United States, along with other global powers, saw Iraq's invasion as a direct threat to the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf, which was essential to the world economy. In response, the United States, under President George H.W. Bush, led a massive international coalition of 34 countries to expel Saddam's forces from Kuwait. The coalition included Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, as well as Western powers like the United Kingdom, France, and Canada. The Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, began in January 1991 with a devastating air campaign followed by a ground assault that swiftly liberated Kuwait. The war's outcome had lasting consequences for the Middle East. Saddam Hussein's defeat in the Gulf War did not end his rule over Iraq, but it severely weakened his military power and left Iraq in a state of ruin. The United States, now the dominant power in the region, established military bases in the Gulf and began an era of heavy involvement in the Middle East that would continue for decades. Iraq, however, remained a threat, and the UN sanctions imposed on Saddam's regime would continue to cripple the Iraqi people for years. The Gulf War also marked a new era in U.S. foreign policy, with America emerging as the primary security guarantor in the Gulf. The American military presence in the region was solidified, and the United States became more deeply involved in the region's affairs, both in terms of securing oil resources and ensuring regional stability. This increased U.S. involvement would set the stage for future conflicts, particularly in Iraq. The post-Gulf War period saw a dramatic shift in the political dynamics of the Middle East. With Saddam Hussein still in power in Iraq and the threat of his regime looming over the region, the United States and its allies focused their efforts on containing Iraq's weapons of mass destruction (WMD) programs and preventing the spread of Islamic extremism. However, the 1990s saw the rise of a new and dangerous ideology that would define the future of the Middle East: Islamic extremism. The roots of modern jihadist movements can be traced back to the aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989, where fighters, many of whom were supported by the United States, formed the basis of Al-Qaeda. Led by the infamous Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda sought to create a global jihadist movement aimed at overthrowing secular governments in the Middle East and replacing them with radical Islamic rule. Bin Laden's ideology was fueled by a combination of resentment against Western powers, particularly the U.S., and anger over the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia following the Gulf War. The 1990s were a time of growing Islamic radicalization, with Al-Qaeda orchestrating a series of attacks against Western targets, including the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. The rise of radical Islamic groups was met with harsh repression in many Arab states. But these groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, began to gain traction among disillusioned youth in the region, who felt alienated by their governments and the West. The ultimate culmination of this growing extremism came on September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda carried out the deadliest terrorist attack in history, targeting the United States. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon shocked the world and marked the beginning of the War on Terror. The United States, under President George W. Bush, launched a military campaign to dismantle Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, leading to the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. The War on Terror would become a defining feature of U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century. The U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan was followed by the controversial invasion of Iraq in 2003, which led to the toppling of Saddam Hussein, but also set the stage for years of instability and violence in the region. The rise of groups like ISIS, which emerged from the ashes of Al-Qaeda, showed that the fight against extremism was far from over. The War on Terror not only transformed the Middle East, but also had far-reaching effects on global politics. The U.S. presence in the region, its military interventions, and its support for various regimes created a volatile environment that continues to affect the Middle East today. The rise of Islamic extremism, fueled by ideological, political, and economic factors, remains one of the most significant challenges the region faces. The Middle East continues to be one of the world's most volatile regions. As the 21st century progresses, the region remains a focal point for both local and international conflicts. From the wars in Iraq and Syria to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the chaos in Yemen, the Middle East is engulfed in a never-ending cycle of violence, instability, and geopolitical intrigue. The aftermath of the 2003 Iraq War and the 2011 Arab Spring have further complicated the region's future. The Iraq War, which saw the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, left the country in ruins, with sectarian violence rising between Sunni and Shia groups. The power vacuum created by Saddam's downfall allowed extremist groups like ISIS to thrive, leading to a new wave of radical violence that spread across Iraq and Syria. The Syrian civil war, which erupted in 2011, has created a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable proportions. Millions of Syrians have fled their homes, and the war has drawn in global powers, including the United States, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, each with their own agendas. Meanwhile, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues to be one of the most intractable issues in global politics. Despite numerous peace efforts and international pressure, the situation remains unresolved, with no clear path toward a lasting solution. The ongoing violence, the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and the humanitarian plight of Palestinians have ensured that this conflict remains a source of tension in the region and beyond. Beyond these well-known conflicts, the Middle East also faces new challenges. The rise of authoritarian regimes, economic instability, and the quest for power by regional actors have only deepened the sense of hopelessness in many parts of the region. The youth, often the victims of these wars and political upheavals, remain caught between a desire for reform and the oppressive realities of their governments. At the same time, the discovery of new oil and gas reserves has made the Middle East even more strategically significant in the global economy. With the ongoing global shift toward renewable energy, however, the region faces uncertainty about its future role in the global energy market. Despite the turmoil, the Middle East is not without hope. In some areas, efforts at reconciliation, economic development, and peace-building are underway. Regional cooperation and diplomacy, particularly among Arab states and with global powers, may eventually offer a path to stability. However, these efforts are often hindered by entrenched political, sectarian, and ideological divisions. The future of the Middle East remains uncertain, but its ability to recover from the conflicts and divisions of the past century will be crucial not only for the people of the region, but for global peace and security. The Middle East is a region defined by its rich history, strategic importance, and tragic struggles. From the fall of the Ottoman Empire to the imposition of colonial borders by European powers, The modern Middle East was born out of decisions made without regard for its diverse peoples. The arbitrary borders drawn by the Sykes-Picot Agreement and other colonial agreements have shaped the region's identity in ways that continue to reverberate today. The discovery of oil in the early 20th century and the region's strategic location have made it a focal point for global powers, from the British and French to the United States, Russia, and beyond. These outside powers have often acted in their own self-interest, exacerbating conflicts and supporting regimes that have further entrenched instability. The rise of radical ideologies, such as those espoused by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, has added another layer of complexity to the region's challenges. The desire for control over oil, the fight for political power, and the aspirations of different ethnic and religious groups have all led to endless cycles of violence and suffering. Yet, amid the darkness, the Middle East is a region of immense potential. Its history is a testament to the resilience of its people, who have lived through centuries of change, conflict, and upheaval. Despite the divisions and challenges, there is a shared desire for peace, prosperity, and dignity. As the region faces new challenges in the 21st century, the lessons of the past should guide its future. The Middle East's journey is far from over. And while the path to peace and stability may be long and difficult, there is always the hope that future generations will find a way to transcend the legacies of war and division. In conclusion, the story of the Middle East is one of tragedy and triumph, of destruction and renewal. It is a region where history is written in the blood of its people, but also in the strength of their resolve. The Middle East will remain a pivotal area of global concern for years to come, and how the world engages with it will define not only its future, but the future of the entire planet.